Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Everything VR and AR podcast brought to you by the VRARA Association. We have a great show for you today that we'll get into here in just a minute. But don't forget, you can get on the VRARA Association's weekly newsletter called the VRAR Beat by going to thevrara.com. We have over 15,000 people that have now signed up for the weekly newsletter, and it contains information on all that's happening with our over 40 chapters that we have around the world. You can also inquire there about becoming a member of the VRAR Association, which will get you special access to industry analyst reports, discounts on conferences around the world, and it gets you access to a searchable directory of over 3,900 companies in the VR and AR space. But best of all, it keeps you in the know. It keeps you networked and connected with the leaders that are shaping the VR and AR industry. Welcome back, everyone, to the Everything VR and AR podcast. We're honored today to be joined by Amy Peck, who is the founder of EndeavorVR, a leading global VR and AR strategy and consulting firm, among other things that we'll get into. But welcome to the show, Amy.
Hi, thanks so much for having me today.
Absolutely. I mentioned, you're the founder of EndeavorVR, which is doing a lot of strategy and consulting work, but you're also the co-founder of BoundlessXR, a simulation and training platform, as well as being the head of enterprise strategy at UploadVR.
Indeed.
So a lot on the table for you. I know you speak very regularly all over the world, mostly on enterprise VR and also in augmented reality. And then we're very fortunate to have you as the co-chair of the Enterprise Committee at the VRARA Association. So thank you for that.
Oh, no, I love it, and I love working with all of our colleagues from the association. Excellent.
One more thing I wanted to add before we dive into the conversation here is that, before you founded Endeavor and co-founded BoundlessXR, you were the enterprise division lead at Leap Motion, correct?
Yes. And that's kind of where I fell back into virtual reality.
That had to have been a phenomenal experience in and of itself, but we can maybe touch on that in a little bit. But I wanted to kick off this conversation. I think the general conversation we'll have today is around the enterprise industry, because you're definitely an expert in that. But we're seeing consumer AR really start to take off. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the eminence of consumer AR and what you're seeing in that industry before we dive into enterprise, if that works for you.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's interesting today, was kind of the made by Google announcements with the two new Pixels and new Daydream, sort of updated Daydream View. And we even had a party here to watch the Apple announcements a couple of weeks ago, which we did live stream. And, it was interesting because everybody here at our office where Upload is, we're all kind of disappointed that there wasn't a lot of talk about AR, especially around the new iPhone 8 and 10 coming out, and then of course today with the two new Pixels. But I actually look at that as sort of an opportunity in that we want to manage expectations around consumer AR. Consumers, aren't really aware yet of how they'd use it. Pokemon Go came out last summer, in a very sort of splashy way. But you probably have played it as well. It's a fairly rudimentary use of the technology. AR Kit and AR Core have been out now for a while, and developers have been, building some really cool solutions, both, for entertainment and games, but also for utility. And I think what'll be interesting here is as consumers discover AR, we'll start to identify really like the vernacular of the interactions. We're so used to how we interact with our phones, right? So we understand what swiping does, we understand what press and hold does, we understand what pinching does, but we really don't know what those, primarily physical interactions are going to look like for consumers. And so that's part of the discovery process. And I think it's actually a positive thing that, as we learn more about how consumers interact with AR, that will start to be baked into the next AR Kit and AR Core. And then that in turn is going to start to inform how we look at building those seamless interactions in the workplace for enterprise and commercial use cases.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So how do you see maybe a few details of how this consumer AR, which is primarily being launched as mobile AR on mobile devices. How's that going to impact the enterprise and maybe, parlaying that into AR glasses versus having an AR mobile experience?
It's interesting because I really just think it's more about exposure. The more, consumers, because, consumers are also running, Fortune 500 companies. We forget that just because people are in enterprise, they're still consumers. So as this becomes kind of part of our everyday digital landscape, I think CEOs and CTOs and R&D teams and people responsible, and I focus more on kind of the back-end process-oriented simulation and training side of enterprise, not as much on things like e-commerce, but it's just that understanding of what the technology can do that, as it sort of permeates the consumer mindset, I think that's really going to help us along on the enterprise strategy.
That's a good point. Now, before we really dive into some of the enterprise XR, I know you use the term XR, and we've heard MR, right? AR, VR. So for some of the audience that may not be familiar with that, can you kind of talk about the differences between those and your definitions?
Well, I like to think of AR as more of a computing platform. So, if you think of a heads-up display, it's really just any digital object in your field of view, but you can completely see your surroundings. And then from there, we kind of move into MR, where you are actually inhabiting your digital landscape in some form or another, but you can still see your surroundings. And then to VR at the other end, where you're fully immersed, you're really going into VR for a particular purpose. It's like learn something, to be entertained, to play a game, or to interact in some way. We all have a lot of arguments within the industry ourselves as sort of, what really is XR, and we're sort of using it. And it seems to be fairly prevalent now as the umbrella under which all of the realities live. And some people, refer to it as extended reality or expanded reality. I've even heard the thought that, the X is like a variable in math, where the X can stand for AR, MR, VR. Again, as this permeates the consumer landscape, the consumers will find their own name for it, but we have found that XR is really the umbrella term that most of us in the industry are using.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know before we started the podcast, you and I were discussing a recent event that you were at with Robert Scoble, and so he has some thoughts and opinions on this too. Is he starting to use the XR umbrella as well, or how does somebody like him, who's an advisor to the VRARA Association, I'm interested in his opinion.
He's been using XR as well. He and I do differ sometimes in the VR adoption piece, and I think he's now very, very gung-ho on AR, and we even did a little live stream Facebook interview here at Upload with the new COO of Upload, Ann Ward, and another one of our colleagues here. And I said, VR is not dead. It's now part of the process of educating consumers, and AR is going to really be at the forefront of that in the short term. But that will also help VR become a little more popular with consumers, because they're going to start to understand what all of these realities really mean. So I'm not quite as negative on the future of VR as he is, but I do think it's a fairly long road before we really see a lot of consumer adoption on the VR side.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I hear is a constant challenge for both AR and VR is content creation. And in many cases, it's literally the digital asset that's going to live in an AR, VR world. But we're starting to see some of these newer platforms be released where you design digital content and it can live in both, right?
Exactly.
So this AR, to your point, like new digital asset creation for AR, all of a sudden, the byproduct is, hey, AR now has some new use cases as well, probably.
Exactly. And that's actually one of the solutions that we've been talking about with a number of different companies that a lot of enterprise entities are looking for is sort of a digital asset management system for their 3D content. And that's going to start to be very, very valuable for companies as they're able to utilize these individual assets in sort of a cross-functional fashion for many, many different solutions, across the XR landscape.
Right. Well, and I think just recently, in fact, this morning, I saw Amazon made an acquisition for this company that scans human bodies and turns it into a 3D digital asset. So that's just another, that's one sub area of this whole digital content creation. I guess as we're talking about that, what are your thoughts on that part of the industry and how that might even play into enterprise for training purposes or other use cases?
Oh, yeah. So on the enterprise side, scanning a body, representing safe behaviors in the workplace or a particular process that they need to represent. And then that particular avatar can go into a training module that we can, and we can even be scanning the trainee as they're mimicking the behaviors that they're seeing in the VR landscape.
So as we look at some of these different use cases in enterprise, what are a couple strong use cases? And, to the extent you can, talk about the companies that are actually starting to implement this now.
There's some incredible use cases. On the AR front, I think one of the best use cases is remote technical assistance. There are a number of companies working on that. In fact, Volkswagen has what they're calling MARTA, which is a mobile augmented reality technical assistance. There's another company called EtherAir that actually one of our esteemed VRARA Enterprise Committee members is head of biz dev there, Rika Nakazawa. But this is an incredible use case. So to be able for a remote field technician to be able to access the expertise of perhaps a more senior technician back at base camp. And there's not always as many expert technicians as there are field technicians. In fact, it's usually a fairly lopsided number. So anytime that a company can save that travel time with one of their experts, there's an incredible advantage to that. And then the second piece of it is that entire interaction between a field expert who can, on the fly, using computer vision and AR glasses, can see exactly what the technician is working on, can throw up schematics on the fly, can annotate, and can really walk the technician through whatever repair needs to happen. But then that entire interaction can be recorded and become part of an archive. And then again, using machine learning and AI, and through the computer vision, we'll be able to recognize when another technician in the future is in front of that same problem. And so that first line of defense would be the recorded interaction with the expert. So it sort of really builds efficiency upon itself.
Wow. So these examples that you just gave, for example, Volkswagen, what type of hardware and software are they using that's kind of powering all this?
I'm more familiar with Ether's platform, and they're very good, and it's similar to what Volkswagen is using. And they've created in a very smart way, which I think all of the companies who are looking at these types of solution are doing. And it's not just that front-end interaction. So there's the glasses component, and then there's often a mobile device. But the glasses makes it much more efficient in that the technicians are able to, free up their hands if they're, particularly if they're working on, a complex piece of equipment. But then there's a middleware, which is a sort of an account management system that allows both technicians to be logged in. And then there's the back end kind of data piece that's actually recording the entire interaction. And these end-to-end sort of platform solutions, I think, are going to be the winners in the space because, just building that front end piece, it really has to integrate into whatever systems the companies are using. And that's why Volkswagen has been so smart about, bringing in for them, a custom built bespoke solution that works entirely within the construct of the Volkswagen technician realm.
Okay. And when you mentioned EtherAir too, I believe their system works with several different AR glasses, ODG, Epson, Vuzix, right? Some of the leaders that are out there.
Yes, and so that'll be a fairly simple out-of-the-box solution. So if they, a company has the ability to really choose the glasses and the form factor that works best for them, and I believe Ether even has their own hardware, but I think they're focused very much now on being embedded in other glasses as well.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about the automotive industry. What are some of the other industries that are really starting to see benefit from this?
Well, I think one of the big ironies is that, I work with a lot of the big box retailers, and there's a focus very much on the consumer and customer kind of, brand experiences, brand activations. But where I really see the value is, for VR in particular, is in, simulation and training and process training, within the workforce, and particularly in warehouses. And there's several companies doing that as well. There's Beyond Reality is one company working in that space. I've just co-founded another company, BoundlessXR, and really I was working with game developers and putting them forward for, again, building these kind of customized solutions for some of my clients. And after they kind of deftly won a couple of, fairly big jobs with some large companies, we really started talking about how it really makes sense to build out a full platform so that as we're, customizing that front end piece, which we will most likely need to do for, most companies that we'd be working with, there still are so many just basic safety mechanisms and sort of OSHA compliance that can be generic lessons so that we're able to offer this solution to companies who wouldn't necessarily have the funds available to build a custom solution, but we're still able to really train their workforce in a much more efficient manner. And one of the other great use cases for VR training is as an assessment tool. There's so many companies, like even just a phone company, for example, they may spend, a few weeks training somebody up to be, an outside field technician. Then they get them out in the field and they're afraid of heights. And they're terrified once they get up there. I mean, these are very simple things that we don't consider. And then again, working on oil rigs or in very, very dangerous situations that you simply can't replicate in real life. We're even looking at training firemen on their fire trucks. I mean, there's many, many, many hours of training that go in, but that's another focus because when you think about it, they're really going from classroom training and maybe some video training, or maybe they have a semi-immersive setup where they might have 3 or 4 screens and do some interactive work online. But then they're in the trucks, on the road, driving around. There's really nothing in between. And what VR is really designed to do in that VR training realm is to sit between that classroom and practical. And again, be a great assessment tool. And then using things like, Google Street View and Google Maps, where we can even train any kind of a driver. I know UPS is starting to implement some of this as well. FedEx, we can train mail carriers, fire departments, police departments. We can train them actually in the environment where they will be driving.
Right. Well, and so how do these companies, obviously, you touched on a few things that are obvious general returns on investment, so efficiencies in the workforce, but then also the effectiveness of some of these training components. But is there an example of where you might talk us through how the hard ROI is being looked at, or maybe is this too early for that and companies are saying, hey, we're just going to test this and see what happens, and it's just part of their innovation division, and they don't know where the ROI is going to come from, but they're willing to try and learn?
I think it's a little bit of all of those things. It's definitely a slow road. I think with most of the companies I'm working with, they're either kind of pre-POC, or they've just launched a POC, or they've just now started to get enough data back to really build an effective, scalable roadmap. There is a fair amount of data out there. Now, we can talk about that later because that's one of the things that we are doing with the Enterprise Committee, with the VRARA, is looking at that and kind of putting together some metrics around it. But the government has been using this technology to train, in the military, also for aviation for decades. So there is a lot of data out there. It's a little bit fractious. A lot of it is secure data that we're just never going to get access to. But when you tell the story, the way it is we are getting any adoption in enterprise is that executives do understand the safety mechanism. They do understand the value of being able to, put someone in an immersive environment. The biggest issue that we have relative to that is just the experience of putting people through VR. So we can tell that story and people buy it. Yes, it makes perfect sense that training someone in a virtual environment on an actual piece of equipment that they'll be working on intellectually makes much more sense. But being able to articulate that value when someone has never been in VR is the big challenge. And so where we are with companies that are, again, I go back to that data piece. It's where now we can look at how that employee was trained. Then we can track them through whether it's a telematics product or whatever kind of tracking mechanism and metrics that companies are using to track performance on the floor. Then that goes through the database, and then we sort of blend those two levels of data points, and then that informs how the training evolves from there. But that, as you can imagine, even just explaining this is a long process. So we're definitely a couple of years out to really have some hard metrics around the ROI.
Yeah, that makes sense. And when you're talking with some of these Fortune 500 companies in the enterprise space, is the attention of the C-suite there yet? Or are we going to have to see a lot bigger numbers in terms of potential ROI before you get, the CEO and the rest of the C-suite really involved in this?
It really runs the gamut. That's something that's been a topic for us, and I work with a number of companies, including Endeavor, but here at Upload, and companies like Accenture. I do a lot of seminars for C-level executives just to do what we just talked about, which is to put them through VR. Because if you've ever, I've just hosted an event at TEDx Marin where we had a mixed reality cube, and we put through probably 50 or 60 people, most of whom had never been in VR, through VR. And it's one of the greatest things in the world to just watch people get in and see what it really is. Because even the people standing and watching the screen before they go in can't believe the difference between what it looks like in a 2D screen and what it feels like when you're really there. And so that's really part of it. And again, this is going back to our topic today, is where I feel AR is really going to start to help that along. Because as we become more and more used to having these digital objects and these 3D digital objects in our field of view, when we're able to see our surroundings, I believe that will start to pique the curiosity of what it really means to be fully immersed. And as these experiences start to kind of populate our everyday lives, I think we'll even find ways that we haven't thought of yet to utilize both technologies.
Those are great points. And as you talk through that, another question came up. Have you seen any really good examples of solutions that will take you from a VR experience back to AR at all? I mean, a lot of people are saying that's where we're all headed. Even Mark Zuckerberg has talked about that on the 10-year plan at Facebook. So have you seen any early stage implementations of that or even testing?
There's a lot of testing going on, and I think that, on two fronts, a lot is happening in education where, a student, there's a company called Blipper, I think they're based in Europe, might be in the UK, and they have an application where you sort of can scan an object, and then there's, more information will sort of pop up in front of a student. Like, for example, if you're at a museum and you're standing in front of a sculpture or an object, and then being able to take those, again, when we talk about the digital asset management, taking those digital objects so that a student could then go into VR and go back into the museum environment and then do a deep dive into, let's say, for example, they were in the museum and they scanned an Egyptian artifact. They could then, tag that on their phone, send it to their, account, and then go into the VR version of that program and actually go to Egypt and see how that object might have been used at that time. I mean, if you can imagine that, I think there's really no better way for kids, especially, to learn than to really see these environments that we're learning in history and even be propelled into the future of what could be.
That's a great example right there. When we talked earlier, you have quite a busy schedule traveling the world. You're speaking in New York, in Munich, back to San Francisco, Palo Alto.
Back to New York.
Right. And so with your global travels, is there any geography that really surprises you that you've seen and said, wow, there's way more happening here than most of the world realizes?
I think that's everywhere. And one of the great use cases that I do talk about is both travel and sort of this notion of collaboration in VR. So, for example, being able to go to a country and visit it and maybe even have a local host while you're in VR show you around and share the customs with you and the local foods and local flavors. Because I think there's two types of travelers. I think they're the types of travelers that want to go and kind of tick off all the boxes. And then there are travelers who want the true sort of authentic experience. They want to go where the locals go. They want to see what the locals see. And I'm sort of a hybrid. Like I was in Beijing this summer with my son, and we did this kind of back streets alley tour and went to some old speakeasies, which was very local and cool. But then, of course, we went to the Summer Palace and we went to the Great Wall. And, it would have been great to have had even more understanding of what we were doing, where we were going. We could have planned a little bit better. And especially since time is always of the essence.
Right.
It would have been great for me to go into VR and have the whole thing all worked out prior.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about this enterprise committee that you co-chair on the VRAR Association. And just as a little backdrop for any of the listeners, with the VRAR Association, we've grown a pretty massive membership base across 40 different chapters globally. As we were just talking about, geographies are important to have connections locally. But we had this need come up where a lot of the members were saying, hey, we need to start a committee that's dedicated to a particular vertical or industry and really dig deep and get some of the knowledge base across, the different members to participate. And so there's now, I think, over 25 different committees, and you're co-chairing the Enterprise Committee. So maybe you could talk through some of the current initiatives, and if there's anyone out there that's listening, maybe some of the different types of talent that you might be looking that would be helpful for the committee to participate.
I mean, the VRA area has been an incredible resource, not only just for me personally and just helping me stay abreast of trends and what's going on in the industry and in all of the various verticals, but also as far as, an ecosystem of both service providers and, enterprise entities, and really understanding what, our members, a lot of whom are incredible developers and have great teams, are building amazing solutions. So to be able to have that, access to really the top service providers in the industry has been invaluable. Then also, we've been, attracting these great enterprise companies. I think we've got Microsoft and Samsung. We've got, I think, even a member from HTC has joined. And so to have their perspective and for us to have this open dialogue, it's like, okay, you're an enterprise entity. What are you looking for? Or you're, a hardware provider. What are the solutions that you're seeing out there? And how can we help? And how can we all engage? And we've actually just this week put out a survey from the Enterprise Committee. There's two tracks. One is for service providers and developers and consultants who are working in the space and really servicing the AR/VR world. And then the other track is for the enterprise companies. And the goal is to really see where the challenges are, where the opportunities are, and really work together towards just, really building these early wins for companies.
That's incredible. Well, thanks for all you're doing on that committee. As you look at whether it's involvement with the committee or just through a lot of your consulting work or travels, kind of looping back to the first part of this conversation where we talked about consumer AR, have you seen anything like really powerful that is taking place in the enterprise world that the consumer-based companies should be looking at and paying attention? I
love the kind of splashy v-commerce. In fact, actually, store number 8, which is Walmart's Innovation Center, they're having a competition that's running right now, actually, with 5 or 6 companies who are building really, really amazing v-commerce solutions. And as far as like consumer touching solutions, I think that is, one of the most valuable and interesting use cases. And I kind of look at that as sort of front end and back end. And front end is really any of these, whether it's a brand experience or whether it's e-commerce that touches the consumer directly. And I think of the back end as more kind of, process, workflow, and training oriented. And I think that's really exciting. And I love the fact that companies are investing in that. And I'd love to see, I think, the budgets spread a little more evenly across both the consumer. The consumer side tends to just typically get more budget because marketing teams have a lot more play with their budgets on a quarterly basis. Whereas I think R&D teams, it's, again, we talked about this ROI piece, and it really has to have some solid metrics around it. So I'd love to see a lot more of those dollars being spread equally across the different factions and use cases with AR and VR. But AR is, I really think consumer AR, I think it's going to help. And I think as we find the utility, and there's things that I saw one application where you sort of hold up your phone, and it's a pretty famous, image by now, has been shared quite a bit, but you hold up your phone at the end of a street and all of the Yelp reviews from the various restaurants kind of show up in your field of view. And that's just a simple use case, but it has some great utility. It's like, oh, we're hungry. What's right here? What's the best place to go? And there's going to be a lot more of that. And as we find just not only the entertainment piece, but really the utility of AR on the consumer level, I think we're going to start to see companies spend a little bit more money on the workflow piece once we see that, yes, this really does have value. This can streamline workflow, even for an office worker at a desk.
Coming up in the next couple of weeks, we talked a little bit about your traveling and speaking at a couple different venues. The next one I see on your agenda here is October 16th, NY 2020. And the topic is prescription for VR and VR medicine. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that we haven't really touched on in this conversation, but could you give us a sneak peek about kind of what you'll be talking about in New York?
Healthcare and wellness in general has, some great use cases for AR and VR in that realm. And I know we'll be talking a little bit about, medical training, and also being able to look at patient scans in a VR environment. And that's something that I find particularly fascinating is the notion that instead of, you're having your one physician and then he or she may consult with a couple of outside physicians, for, physicians from around the globe to actually be able to, from completely different disciplines and perspectives, all be in a virtual environment together looking at the same patient scan. I think that the future of medicine where that goes and really being able to look at many, many different medical approaches is going to start to have a really amazing impact on the medicine of the future. And so we've got some great guests, and got Adam from NYU Langone Center, who really has he's been in the business for a very long time and has some great insights. So I think it's going to be a fantastic panel.
Sounds like it. And then shortly thereafter, you're headed to AWE Europe in Munich, speaking on Enterprise VR, right?
I know another actually that one's global collaboration. It's similar to the talk I did at AWE in Beijing, talking about both the practical elements of collaboration in VR. And one of the nice things about VR is, with HTC, and Oculus and the high-end headsets, you can have multiplayer mode, which, yes, is one of the many sort of game constructs, but from collaboration perspective is incredibly valuable. So for remote, the automotive industry has already embraced this technology. So remote design teams can actually, be together, in the same environment, looking at the same design and working together. and that's for AR as well. And actually, there's a company here out of Upload called Finger Food, and they can build full-scale AR models of. I think they're working with Peterbilt, and they have a full scan of an 18-wheeler, and the designers were able to walk around in HoloLens, and they were able to see how different wind patterns would affect the cab of the truck, and design accordingly to sort of maximize the wind resistance. So it's just a fantastic use case there as well. So yeah, definitely collaboration in VR, I think, is another great solution.
Yeah, that's a good point you make, because you hear a lot about like collaboration, or more referred to as social VR from the consumer perspective, but you make a great point about how important it is in the enterprise space as well. So it sounds like a great travel schedule that you have. And if people can't catch you on the travel circuit, let's call it that, then how do people get a hold of you if maybe they're interested in having you do some consulting work for them?
The easiest is just to send me an email, and it's amy@EndeavorVR.com, or go to the website, and there's a contact link there. And if I'm out of town, I have a couple of project managers who are also feverishly working all the time, but one of us will be able to get back to you.
Excellent. And so that's the best way to get a hold of you. How about, you're pretty active on Twitter, right, as well?
I am indeed. My personal Twitter, well, it's personal business Twitter is @virtualgirlny. And even though I'm in San Francisco now, you can take the girl out of New York.
Nice.
I still have my 917 number.
I like it. That's great. Well, Amy, this has been a really good conversation, and hopefully most of our listeners will be able to catch you at one of these events that you're speaking at. And I encourage everybody to go to your website at EndeavorVR and look through that. Amy, thanks for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Nathan.
This episode is brought to you by Artillery Insights, which is a monthly subscription research package from the VRAR Association and VRAR intelligence firm Artillery. Consisting of industry data and insights, it will equip players in the AR and VR sectors to make informed business decisions. So for more information or to find out how to subscribe, go to artillery.co, which is ARTILLRY.co, and scroll down to the subscription link. You can also go to the VRARA.com website and look for the Resources tab, then Research and Reports. That's Artillery without an E. Artillery Insights. It's about gaining a knowledge position.